Hi, my name is Wayne Robertson, and I'm the Writing Center Director here at Towson University. Professor Lee invited me to speak to your Health 315 class about organizing and integrating research effectively. I hope that these comments will be useful and that you can use them as you're writing your grants for this class. The first thing I want to talk about today is how to organize and keep track of your sources. It's pretty easy when you only have maybe 5 or 6 sources that you're working from, but as those papers get longer, like say a grant, in which you might have 30 or 40 sources, and the piece itself might be 30 or 40 pages long. It gets harder and harder to actually keep track of all the different research that you're doing. After all, you're probably going to have sources about the community that you're serving. You're going to have sources about the methodology that you're using. You're going to have sources that talk about similar projects or community needs, right? You're going to have all these different types of sources that you're working on. And the trick is that when you start getting that many sources together, it's really hard to kind of keep track of everything and to be efficient as you're doing your research. Because, after all, as you're doing your research, you're also learning about your subject, right? And so sometimes it's really difficult because you might not have an outline of what you want to say until you do some research first. And so sometimes as you're doing your research, you don't even know yet what is important, let alone like where it's going to actually come in the paper itself. And so what I used to do is I used to actually go through and I'd read a ton of articles and I'd highlight them all individually. And then what I'd have to do is then I'd start writing because I kind of knew then what I was going to work on. But the problem was that all my research was all confused in these 30 different sources. And I'd highlighting on them, but trying to find them and flip through, I'd just continue flipping through like page after page, having to reread my research again and again. And it just was exhausting to try to do things that way. And so what I started doing is I started using something different. It's called a dual document approach. And it really helped me understand and organize my research and be more efficient in how I was doing my research. So what does this actually look like? So when I very first start doing my research, even if I don't know yet exactly what I'm using, what I do is I copy and paste any passage or piece of research or data that I think might end up being useful for me. And so I take that and I copy and I paste it into one document. I kind of leave it messy at first because I don't know exactly where it's going to go or things like that yet. But I copy and paste it, and I make sure to put an in-text citation right behind it. And that way I know exactly where this came from. The second step is that, as I'm reading my research, I'm also kind of starting to get an outline for what I want to do in my own document, right? That's going to become, of course, my paper that I'm writing. And the next step, basically, is I start merging these two documents together. I start looking at how they intersect. For me, I actually like to use color coding just because I'm a very visual person, and that gives me a really easy link between the two documents. Other people do it different ways, but that's what I found works for me. And then the process of writing is actually the process of taking these two documents, the outline of what you want to say, and on the other hand, these passages in the research that you want to put into the paper, it's the process of merging these two documents together. So let's take a look at an example of this. This is a paper that is about leadership styles. And on the left-hand side, you can see my outline. And on the right-hand side, you can see the summary of the research. Now, this is research that I've taken from various different sources. What I've done is I've color-coded it so that these sources and my outline match up. And so I can see that, for example, when I'm describing laissez-faire leadership, on the right-hand side, I've got one source that kind of matches up with that. When I'm discussing the problems of laissez-faire leadership, you'll see that I've got two different sources here and passages. One is kind of just a citation from a source. And the other one is actually a piece of research describing the results that were found from a study on that research. And then when I'm talking about the problems with laissez-faire leadership. I actually have several sources with this that I'm going to be synthesizing together. This just helps me be more organized, and it helps me because basically what I do is I just write those passages, and then when it's time to kind of integrate the source, I kind of go over and I look at it, and then I paraphrase it in to my paper. And that way I'm not missing anything. I'm not like losing any citations. And it's really, it makes, especially longer research papers, it makes it a lot easier to organize. Once you have your sources organized and your outline is put together and you're starting to write your paper, then it's time to incorporate the sources effectively. And the very first thing is that you don't want to let your sources bully you and push you around. And so, you want to avoid starting paragraphs directly with a source, for example. Just those paragraphs that come in, it's like according to, and you just jump right into it. Or, for example, falling into the trap. I see this a lot in literature reviews, where there's kind of like one source per paragraph, and so it's like a summary of this source, and then the next paragraph is a mini summary of this source, and rather than synthesizing these things together and controlling them with the author's own voice and own organization, we end up with almost this list of different sources. And so really what you want to do is you want to integrate as much as possible multiple sources together into the same paragraph, right? So that you're using them. And that the controlling ideas and the controlling outline is really yours. And then you want to vary how you incorporate your sources. So, sometimes you're just going to be using the author's names, or sometimes you use the author's names and introduce the research that way. Sometimes you just want to summarize it and you'll just have an in-text citation. But you want to kind of vary how you're doing this. And you also want to use effective and accurate signal verbs. You want to vary those signal verbs. Signal verbs are the things that, it's like when you say like Robertson acknowledges. Acknowledges is a signal verb. Or several studies have demonstrated. Demonstrated is a signal verb, right? Disputed is a signal verb. I remember when I was in graduate school, my advisor took part of my thesis and it just highlighted the signal verbs and said, "Are you aware that you're only using 5? You keep on saying these same things. Points out, argues, states, points out, argues, states." And not only was that boring, but it also didn't really accurately represent like what the authors of these sources were doing. And so once I went back and started changing those out for more effective signal verbs, suddenly my language, my writing sounded much more academic, and it sounded like I knew what I was talking about. So here's a short list of some of the signal verbs that you can use in your writing. And what I would do is I would just, do a quick Google search, and, you'll find a list similar to this online. And I would not pay attention to this while you're drafting your document. Just write and try to, incorporate your research in there as best you can. But when you're in your editing phase, this is something that I used to go through, and I used to actually highlight all my signal verbs, and then I would look at them and I would kind of compare them with maybe a better signal verb that I could use, and it would make a big difference in how I sounded. So let's look at a practical example of these principles. This is a paragraph from the leadership paper that I referenced earlier. First, I'll read the paragraph, and then I'll examine the various strategies that this writer is using. Laissez-faire leadership may be productive during calm times within organizations. However, the majority of the time, it is an unproductive leadership style that has a negative impact on the workplace. For example, Drumgoole found that laissez-faire leaders provided very little direction for employees. As a result, employees became frustrated and argued with one another, often resulting in infighting and other disruptive behavior. Moreover, employees work under a laissez-faire leader usually receive very little constructive feedback to improve poor work performance or rewards to encourage good performance. The result is that poor or inefficient work habits go unchecked, while productive employees lose motivation. Finally, because laissez-faire leaders are difficult to work with and are inefficient decision makers, work slows down, leading to more tension in the organization. One study of more than 5,000 bank employees found that laissez-faire leadership had a negative relationship to job satisfaction and employee performance. This makes sense because when employees feel like their bosses are unmotivated or impeding their work, those feelings will also impact employee motivation. As a result, laissez-faire leadership can often damage an organization and cause it to lose its best employees. So the first thing we notice when looking at this paragraph is the writer sets up the main point in her own words. She doesn't lead with a source or jump right into the source material. Rather, she frames this paragraph with the point that she wants to make. Similarly, at the end of the paragraph, the writer provides the takeaway in her own words again. What this does is it creates a feeling that the writer is in control, and it adds to her credibility as the writer. And so we get this feeling that this writer is using these sources to essentially say what she wants to say. The second thing that we can notice here is how many sources the writer's integrating. We have 3 separate sources. Each one is used once or twice in the paragraph itself. They are integrated quite smoothly. The writer uses their own transitions. We get, for example, as a result, moreover, and we get the finally, right? So we get these transitions that the author or the writer is using that frame the sources. And you notice also that sometimes the writer is introducing the source with kind of the name and the signal phrase. For example, Drumgoole 2008 found that laissez-faire leaders, blah, blah, blah. And at other times, the writer is just summarizing while incorporating the citation itself. What this does is it leads a nice variation in how the sources are integrated here, and they come across as being integrated very smoothly. So now that we've focused on and learned some strategies for text integration, let's move on to the skill of paraphrasing itself. And paraphrasing is not just word substitution. So sometimes I'll be reading a student's paper, and what they're doing is what we call patch writing. And that basically means that essentially they're just substituting in some words for other words, but so they're not really repeating the words themselves, but the actual organization of ideas, the sentence structure, the style itself, all basically imitate the original author. And that's not really what paraphrasing is. Paraphrasing is when you put something completely into your own words, that idea, and that you're really trying not to use any of the author's original language or original sentence structures. And so now, sometimes that's very difficult. Paraphrasing is one of the hardest skills, I think, in writing. And so, if you run into something like some data or something that's really hard to paraphrase, you can always basically put a short quoted piece in the middle of that paraphrase that just kind of uses that specific small passage, like, just a few words, in quotation marks as part of the paraphrase. You can do that. So here's what I tend to do when I'm trying to paraphrase. What I'll do is I use a dual document process, and so on the one hand I've got the outline, and the other one has the passages. And so what I'll do is when I'm about to write a paragraph, I'll look and I'll read those passages to make sure I understand them, and then I'll write my whole paragraph. I'll close that document or minimize it, and then I'll just basically write the entire paragraph. I might introduce the sources and things like that, but basically I'm just writing the ideas as I kind of understand them and as part of my paragraph. And then what I do is I look back and I check the paraphrase against the original to make sure that I haven't repeated words or the sentence structure or things like that, and that it accurately reflects the original text. And then finally what I do is I look at my signal verbs and I make sure to cite the paraphrases according to whatever citation style I'm using. So let's look at an example together. This is basically a short paragraph about bicycling fatalities and use of helmets. What you'll notice actually is in the original text, there are 4 sentences. And in the example paraphrase, the inappropriate paraphrase here, there are also 4 sentences. In the original text, the organization of ideas is first that you come from bicycle deaths, and then the fact that a lot of those are school-age children, and that one study said that it can be solved. Head injuries can be reduced by 85%, and then you look at the inappropriate paraphrase, and all the sentences do the same thing, right? So the first sentence says, there are 1,000 bicycle fatalities. About half of those fatalities are school-age children. That the bicycle helmets can reduce about 85%. So you have the same structure overall in the paraphrase. In addition, you have a classic patch writing problem going on here, where, like, if you take a look at the first sentence, of the more than 1,000 bicycle deaths each year, and you look at the inappropriate paraphrase, you see of the 1,000 bicycle fatalities each year, you get these large sections that imitate the actual structure of the original, and this is an example of patch writing and not being able to paraphrase properly. So let's look at a better example this time. And so while the last one, the inappropriate paraphrase, had 4 sentences compared to the original, this one is now combined into 3 sentences. The organization of ideas is actually very different. The writer actually starts with the fact that helmets are a great way to reduce bicycling fatalities. The sentences themselves, all of them are differently structured and have different language involved in them. And then finally, this writer has included the citation at the end here so that we know where the information comes from. So this is how you should go about doing a paraphrase. We started off this lecture about basically talking about how to organize our research and creating an outline at the beginning, kind of using this dual document process. But now I want to circle back to the beginning of this presentation and revisit this idea of organizing our ideas. Organizing and creating an outline at the beginning is a great idea, and I'd highly recommend that you have at least some sort of basic outline kind of to work from. However, that's not the only use of an outline. I actually find that the best use of an outline oftentimes comes at the end of the writing process. And what I mean by this is paragraphs are really the building blocks of your paper. You can't see a paper on the sentence level. It's just, there's too many sentences. You can't get an idea of the organization of a paper. And of course, you can't look at the whole thing. And so the paragraphs are really... each paragraph basically does something. It has purpose to it. Some paragraphs maybe are providing context for the reader, right? And those might come up towards the beginning of a paper. Other paragraphs might be explaining the problem or the situation. Other paragraphs might introduce research, or they might introduce a counter argument, right? But every paragraph in your paper should have this type of purpose. And so what I would do is I would read your piece one paragraph at a time. And for each paragraph, just write a sentence that describes the purpose or main point of that paragraph. What this will do is it'll give you a bird's eye view of your paper. And when you see those sentences in order, you can see your own thinking process. You can see if any paragraphs should be moved around. You can identify paragraphs that maybe should be combined because they talk about the same idea. You can see paragraphs that might have 2 or 3 ideas that you want to split apart or move to other sections. And the final real benefit of this is something that I didn't learn until the end of my graduate school career, actually, which was that a lot of us, when we're writing, end up kind of like meandering our way into paragraphs. But the most important sentence in any paragraph is, in fact, the first sentence of the paragraph, because it kind of gives you a roadmap, the reader a roadmap for where you're headed. And so what I used to do a lot, and I've seen this in a lot of other writers too, is we kind of clear our throat at the beginning of the paragraph. We kind of meander our way into that. And by understanding what the purpose is of each paragraph, what you can do is you can create really strong topic sentences. You can create really strong transitions, right? So if one paragraph is introducing a counter argument, and the next paragraph is kind of refuting that, or kind of, providing evidence that says that's not a very good way of looking at it, then you can actually create a transition that does exactly that, signals what you're doing there. You might write something like, while this argument or this counter argument appears, strong at first, there's actually good evidence that it is not as strong as it would appear. And then you can sort of go into that, right? So you can make these really strong logical transitions that will hold your paper together and make it much easier for a reader to understand. Thank you so much for watching this video. I know that Professor Lee has shared our Writing Center videos with you, other videos about how to use the Writing Center, and I do hope that you'll use our services. We really enjoy working on these Health 315 grants, and we actually usually have 3 or 4 on the schedule every day. There are several sections, and we work with a lot of health students on these. So in other words, many of people on our staff are familiar with this assignment and can be really helpful, I think, in your process. When choosing the person to work with, I would choose somebody who works who has APA listed next to their name. Health majors obviously are excellent. Occupational therapy majors, nursing, other people in other health professions, but also people who do APA-based research like psychology or deaf studies. These can also be really people that are really can be helpful. So I hope that you found this video to be useful, and I wish you all the success in your writing that you do this semester. Thank you so much.